Greetings investigators and welcome to tutorial number 38. Let us tell you all about specialist cards. Despite FFG hailing them as a new type of player card, this certainly isn't as radical as it sounds. They look like regular neutral assets, events and skills and play just the same. This isn't a fourth card type or another class, and there are no new slots. There isn't so much as a brand new keyword. Their novelty comes in during deck construction. Normally, neutral cards are universally available to every investigator, unless their deck building restrictions prohibit certain cards. For example, Rex Murphy can't take the neutral card Well Dressed, as it has the Fortune trait, and his deck building restrictions say,
No fortune cards.
Likewise, Carolyn Fern has the restriction,
No weapon cards level 1 to 5.
which prohibits Ornate Bow or Time Worn Brand, but not the level 0 knife, unfortunately. More recent investigators like Michael McGlenn allow cards with particular traits from outside their class. And Joe Diamond actually specifies he must include a minimum amount of insight traded cards. These new specialist cards are kind of the inverse of that. They actually stipulate which groups of investigators can use them for deck building rather than cannot. And not by name like signature cards, but by trait. Did you remember your investigator has traits? The rules are on page 2 of the Drowned City Investigator rulebook and are simple enough. If your investigator has the traits printed on their card that the new specialized card requires, they may use them for deck building. For example, the specialist card Sacred Oath specifies that only investigators with the Cultist, Cursed, or Silver Twilight traits printed on their investigator card can include it in their decks. Which, at the time of recording, is Diana Stanley for Cultist, Calvin Wright, Patrice Hathaway, Amina Zidane, and Kohaku Narukami for Cursed. Finally, Preston Fairmont and Diana Stanley again for Silver Twilight. All these investigators can add this card to their decks by spending the appropriate amount of XP, but no other investigators can. This trait restriction is a hard limit, so Charlie Kane can't hoover up any lovely new specialist card allies unless they specify his traits of Civic or Socialite. Likewise, specialist cards cannot override an investigator's deck building restrictions. Hypothetically, if you had an investigator that had the Hunter, Veteran or Warden traits but was prohibited from taking firearms or weapons or item traded cards, or neutral cards over level 4, or any assets, then they could not take this Mauser here. Given that specialist cards are a subgroup of neutral cards, they could be easy to mix up with your regular cards when deck building, kind of like story assets. Luckily, FFG has made some visual changes to the graphic design to try and make them more distinguishable. Let's compare a regular neutral asset with a specialist card asset. They have changed the grey background to a black one, most noticeable at the top edge, but also in other areas. The background patterning is also different, but it is hard to tell at a glance. The text box has gone from a cold grey to a warmer one. And they have also changed the grey borders and embellishment to a bronze or dull gold. You can see the same changes here on the event cards. And hopefully you can also spot them on the skills. It is easy enough to tell them apart when side by side on a screen, but equally easy to overlook with sleeved cards in poor lighting. Remembering which investigators have which traits and are referenced by what new cards sounds like a real pain in the derriere. Further complicated by the fact that the free print and play parallel investigators can have different traits from their main versions. But luckily this game's amazing community has you covered, and we will link to a Reddit post by Bernat which has a handy infographic allowing you to match the new cards to the investigators that can use them, complete with parallel variants. On their own, traits do nothing, and the most common interaction are cards that reference the firearms trait. Up until now, players hadn't had much reason to notice that each investigator had either one or two traits printed at the top of their ability box, or that the most frequent of these was Drifter. Despite the fact that the original rules reference from 2016 made a point of highlighting that your investigator's flavorful attributes may be referenced by card abilities, this was slow to happen. The Path to Carcosa campaign had a special prologue just for Lola Hayes, who was released in that cycle, but this wasn't because she had the performer trait. Other cycles too have referenced investigators by name, but not by trait. It was the Dream Eaters campaign that went furthest and had a special prologue for each class and also for select traits. But it was the preview article for the Drowned City Investigator Expansion in 2024 that first revealed this new card type to the players and gave the first examples. And the Investigator box released in 2025 contains a whole bunch more, but thankfully without getting rid of regular neutral cards. In the Drowned City Investigator box, there are 24 different cards by title. This breaks down into 14 assets, 6 events, and 4 skills. They vary in cost from 1 to 5 experience. There are no level 0 specialist cards. Each has traits of their own, so you will find allies, spells, and items amongst them. Each investigator currently released can take at least one of these cards, so no one is left out. Most of them are tied to 3 different traits, so can be used by quite a few investigators. 3 of them, including both library passes, only work with 2 traits, and another 3 are actually linked to 4 traits. So that wraps up tutorial number 38. Hopefully you will find these straightforward to use, and maybe we will see them reappear in a future expansion.